from today's panel, which is True Crime Inside the Mind of Mayhem. The images you see on the walls are our newest exhibition. We just put this up yesterday. And these are wood engravings, images from the Phillipson Bible. And this exhibition was curated by Andrew Raftery, who's Associate Professor of Printmaking at the Rhode Island School of Design. And he was assisted by Hallie Cohen, who is the curator here at the Philoctetes Center. The exhibition actually coincides with a roundtable we're going to be having in a couple of weeks, which is Freud psychoanalysis and the Phillipson Bible, which is going to talk about the impact that these images had on Freud's thinking. And that's going to be on Saturday, November 15th. I'd like to now introduce the moderator for today's event. Spencer Eth is a professor and vice chairman in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at New York Medical College. He serves as the medical director of behavioral health services at St. Vincent Catholic Medical Centers, whose Manhattan campus was the closest trauma hospital to Ground Zero. For the last 20 years, Dr. Eth has studied and treated children, Vietnam veterans, and others struggling with issues of trauma and grief. And Dr. Eth was also a moderator and a panelist for a previous roundtable that we had called Psychic Trauma, Mind, Brain, Community. And Mr. Eth will be introducing the other panelists. Welcome.
Which one?
Me. Okay. Thank you, and welcome all of you to today's roundtable. I'm going to begin by introducing our distinguished panelists. First, the gentleman to my left is John Coston, who is a news editor at the national desk of the Wall Street Journal. He has also written two nonfiction true crime books, Sleep My Child Forever in 1995, about Ellen Boehm, who murdered her two young sons and attempted to kill her daughter. He also wrote To Kill and Kill Again in 1992, which documented the story of Wayne Nance, a Montana serial sexual killer. Seated on the couch is Dr. Shoba Sreenivasan. Shoba is a forensics and clinical psychologist from Los Angeles, California, clinical professor at University of Southern California in the Department of Psychiatry, and a forensic psychiatrist who has done hundreds of evaluations of criminals of all types, including murderers and sexual violent predators. Seated across from me is Joe Loya. Joe now works for a prisoner reentry program in Northern California. He has written an autobiography titled The Man Who Outgrew His Prison Cell, Confessions of a Bank Robber, in 2005, which is his memoir of growing up in East Los Angeles, his being a victim of physical abuse by his father, a minister, becoming the Beirut bandit bank robber in Los Angeles, and spending 7 years in prison, including time in solitary confinement. Across from me is, and I'm going to do my best, Xiaolong.
You're right.
Who is from China and received a doctorate from Washington University in St. Louis, has translated Chinese poetry into English, has translated Freud into Chinese, and is probably best known for his 5 Inspector Chen novels written over the last 8 years. One of those is the current 5th is on the table here, and these novels have been translated into many languages and have sold about 1 million copies. So I'm very pleased to welcome our panelists, and I'd like to start the discussion off by reflecting on two contrasting views of the criminal mind. And I'm going to ask our panelists to each indicate which of these two views seems to be more allied with their experiences as clinicians, as journalists, as novelists, and in prison. The first view of the criminal mind is the view noted by the psychiatrist Carl Menninger, who said that crime is everybody's temptation. This is a dimensional view which says that in each of us there is some criminal temptation that, as one forensic psychiatrist said, bad men do what good men dream. That if we deny our dark side, it can only obscure our understanding of violent offenders and impede our ability to both know ourselves and control our own, at times, unacceptable impulses. This is the view in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. This is perhaps what was consistent with Leopold and Loeb, who tried to commit who had been upstanding young citizens until they committed what they thought would be the perfect crime, a horrible murder. The alternative view of criminals, a categorical view, is that the criminal, the violent criminal, is really a monster, is an evil, different breed. The person may masquerade as normal, but really is a sociopath, a psychopath, and different from the rest of us. This is the view of the Mask of Sanity by a psychiatrist, Hervey Cleckley. It's a view of a psychoanalyst, Melita Schmedenberg, who said that the criminal, the major, habitual, tough, hardened, callous criminal differs fundamentally in his psychological makeup and general outlook from the ordinary, accidental offender. Psychiatrically, this group consists of psychopaths, and there have been novels about, there have been true crime stories about such folks in Cold Blood, Badlands, and there have been real-life people who have masqueraded as one book says, the sociopath next door, including physicians. Dr. Harold Shipman, who has the distinction of being killed the most people, the serial killer in England, Michael Swango, who is a physician here. And I would like to invite our panelists, beginning with Dr. Shoba Sreenivasan, to describe their feelings about whether indeed that the criminals are evil, different breed, or are they just like us, but maybe perhaps have lost their ability to control their impulses.
Well, following Dr. Etz's kind of excellent summary of, I think, all the parameters of what evil might be or what a criminal personality might be. In thinking about this presentation, I tried to consider what I thought evil would be. What would cause someone to do evil, to create mayhem on another person? Is there something that's absolutely evil in human nature? Can you draw a bright line between evil and good? I thought back to Cicero, at the time of Julius Caesar, who, in writing about moral duty, said, yes, there is that bright line between good and evil. There is absolute evil, and there is absolute good. Then you have the other part, the counterpart, of the Machiavellian view, Machiavelli's view in The Prince, that things are expedient. There is no real absolute evil. That it's really the situation. And it seemed to me that there is this line drawn between what are called normative ethics, where you say, yes, there's good, there's evil, or consequential ethics, which might be more the Machiavellian view, that you're good when it's expedient to be good, you're evil when it's expedient, there are reasons to be evil to forward good. So I was trying to think about that, and then I thought about the way psychologists and psychiatrists think about evil, going from Harvey Cleckley's Mask of Sanity, which was the first way of looking at psychopathy, where evil is considered to be something that stems from character pathology. And Cleckley thought that evil had to do with certain personality characteristics, being glib, being impulsive, being irresponsible, having kind of Teflon connections with other people, not really emotionally being able to connect to other people. Therefore, you could torture and hurt somebody for your own pleasure because you don't see their pain. So that was Cleckley's view. And then from Cleckley, it moved on to Robert Hare, a psychologist out of Canada, who developed something called the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, which psychologists and psychiatrists use to rate people on psychopathy. So in thinking about that, I wanted to present three kind of slices of psychopathy from three heinous criminals who are famous. The beginning person is someone who's local, the Iceman. So we're just going to do like 2 minutes, and I'd like you just to take a look at these three kind of different slices of psychopathy. So he killed for money. He was a contract killer and killed a number of people. And in the rest of these tapes, he's talking with Park Dietz, a psychiatrist, about that. And one thing that he talks about, he took a lot of pride in his work. He was very creative about it. But he would also he was one of these people with a big ego. And if he was disrespected, it went very badly for the person who disrespected him. So he talked about one case where he's in a bar, he's getting ready to go to the bathroom, and some guy cuts in front of him. And he's enraged by that. So he goes into the bathroom and he follows the guy and he kills him. And he's very proud about how he kills him because he develops this new method of doing it, which is he grabs him by the neck and is able to strangle him with his own shirt. But he grabs him from behind, and it's sort of a new technique. And when he's talking about that, in the several hours that he talks, it's the one time he smiles, because it's sort of like, I did this well, but he doesn't really think about the implications that somebody cutting in front of you to go to the urinal really doesn't deserve the death penalty. But in this guy's mind, it did. So that's one level of the callous empathy. Here's another person. So Kenneth Bianchi kind of terrorized L.A. by being the hillside strangler, and he and his cousin Angelo Bono would go around picking up these young girls. They would pretend to be cops, and they would then take them, strangle them, electrocute them, and rape them. And he did a bunch of these in the state of California, and then he moved up to Washington State, and he did 2 of them, and Bianchi finally got caught. The interesting thing about Bianchi was, even before he got caught, he studied psychology, he studied multiple personality, so he was able to set up this whole multiple personality defense for himself. It was really pretty convincing, and he's a very charming, handsome man. Unlike the Iceman, Kenneth Bianchi was easy on the eyes. He wanted to be a cop. He was very smart. But he had this underbelly to him. And the other thing that he was doing is he would take these young girls and he was pimping them into prostitution, and then he would blackmail the Johns that used him. And there's one very interesting tape in there where a guy by the name of Tiny, this huge biker guy, is hired by the lawyer who Bianchi and his cousin are trying to blackmail. And the big biker guy, Tiny, comes up to Bianchi and Angelo Bono and persuades them not to blackmail the attorney by taking Angelo Bono and pulling him out of the car, out of the window of the car, and so he describes Bianchi as just this little, I won't use a bad word, but was not very impressed with him, and just thought he was just a real coward. And if he had known, Tiny says, that this guy had been going around killing young girls, he would have snapped his neck like a twig. So Bianchi was living this whole underworld, but on the surface he looked very much like an all-American, handsome man who was applying to be a police officer at Washington State and was very close to becoming one. So, and this is Gary Ridgway, the third slice. So Gary Ridgway worked at Kenworth. He did detailing. He was a gainfully employed person for many years. He'd been honorably discharged from the Navy. He was kind of a mousy person who lived next door that no one would have ever suspected did this. But he went around killing. He'd pick up the prostitutes. He would have sex with them, and he would kill them and lay them around the Green River. But then he came back. He also had necrophilia as a part of his psychopathology, and he would go back and have sex with them once they were dead. And he did this for years without ever getting caught. And and one of the other things that he did was he would take all their jewelry and other effects, and he would have garage sales at his house, and he would be selling their items. So those are the three ones. You've got the Iceman, who's very cold-blooded. You've got Kenneth Bianchi, the charmer, and you've got this mousy man, Gary Ridgway, who you would have never suspected.
So your conclusion is that yes, these three exemplify a class of people who are not like the rest of us, who are monsters.
Yeah, I think so, but I think the Iceman looks, the Iceman and Gary Ridgway, I don't think you would have thought were monsters. And Kenneth Bianchi, I think most women would have thought, God, this is a cute guy, because he was a pretty good-looking, charming kind of person. So they were monsters, but really, like you said, they had the mask of social acceptability, good social skills, could pass in society as non-monsters.
A wolf in sheep's clothing. Joe, what do you think?
I've spent time, I had many friends who were murderers and murderers in prison who killed men in prison. My best friend actually killed my ex-cellmate, and for 2 years I was in solitary confinement while they determined that I had nothing to do with it, and that in fact it was my best friend. So I knew these men. And one thing I believe, and I behaved monstrously myself when I was involved in crime. And one thing I don't believe there are monsters. I believe there are people who do monstrous things because they're dislocated from their conscience, or whatever you want to call it, their what I would call conscience. And I go to juvenile halls, and I've conducted writing workshops in juvenile halls. And one thing you see when you see these men, you see the final product. You see adult men. And one thing I see when I go into the juvenile hall is I can almost identify who these guys are going to be that I did time with. I see Tiny, I see Shorty, I see Sharky. I can see who these guys are going to become because I can hear their narrative, the violence, the torture, the sadism, the father turned him on to heroin and got them high. One friend held him down so the father could get him high on heroin when he was 12. You hear these stories, and so that's the way I've come to understand these men, that they're not guys who from birth were dislocated from their emotions or that sort of thing. One thing I found about the friends of mine who were murderers in prison was they were incredibly sentimental men, which was a distortion of good emotion. But they were very sentimental. And I always felt like the way I came to understand my bad behavior was, as a child, I was very sensitive. And the brutality that I experienced made me get to a point where I realized, my optimism and my hope that this isn't going to occur, and my belief that I really love my father and I'm going to forgive him, all those great themes, the higher themes that I believed in, there was no incentive for me to believe in those anymore, because it just continued to wound me. It continued to depress me. It continued to make me despair. And so what I did is I just severed myself from those feelings. And so even because I was a human being who still had these feelings, they sort of came out in a sentimentality. So like you get these guys who end up being, they're called we're called sociopaths because we behave in monstrous ways. But when we get into prison, we actually form community. We actually form bonds with other men. We become like, you're my road dog till the wheels come off, and we feed into this sort of romantic idea of solid emotion, which is still a sort of doesn't work, because you see men betraying each other all the time, killing their best friends, that sort of thing. But there's still almost a remnant of wanting to believe like they did when they were youngsters, but an inability anymore to believe. And so what you find then is men beginning to justify why they behave badly. And they tell themselves this narrative, well, everybody's bad. Everybody's implicated in evil. Why should I not be? I'd be a punk. I'd be weak if I didn't feed into the ethos of the world. And so they become lost in this thinking, because they have to find a way to justify why they're behaving badly. One thing I always found interesting in prison is that the sex offender or the rat, the snitch, they occupy the lowest rung, because men want to say, I'm not as bad as these guys. I'm not them. And so even in the prison, they say, I could be a murderer, I could be somebody who strangled my best friend, but I didn't snitch, or I didn't rape little boys. And so there is this justification to say, I'm a different... I'm better than other folks, and there's this, because you don't want to admit that you're just as corrupt as the sex offender or the snitch. There's just huge mental gymnastics that occurs where guys want to say, I'm not as bad as I seem to be. In fact, in some ways, I'm smarter than regular society because I'm going to swim in this world of dominion. And that's one of the things you notice with this is these men are all committed to dominion. They want to dominate another person. They want to have their violence intersect with another person and reduce them and cut them down and suck their terror out of them. It's all about dominion. And prisoners, that's the way they look at the world and say, everybody's about dominion. The world's about dominion. Why do you judge me?
John?
I think it's interesting that there are, I wasn't aware of the really two schools of thought you stated so clearly, but it's interesting that, the sort of pinnacle of analysis would come down to two different schools of thought competing with each other for some answer. And that works for my answer because I really did experience two different kinds of killer. The first one was really sympathetic person who was abused as a child and was abandoned by her father and then abandoned by her husband and left to cope on her own. And through a long series of sort of attempts to pull it together after filing for bankruptcy, but still holding two jobs, she decided that the way out of this was to take out insurance policies on her children, and she did take them out up to actually $100,000 each for 2-year-olds, and then killed them, and then collected the money. But it was a very organized event. She planned it in advance. She actually copied somebody else who had done something, not the insurance ploy, but something else, killed her own children for the attention. So she was really, there was an awful lot of sympathy. When her children died, her coworkers, raised money for her. She very carefully didn't tell everybody the whole story, so not everybody knew she was getting big payouts for insurance money, but then things started to trickle out, like she bought a new car. Well, how did she afford that? The other killer was, it reminded me when you said as a teenager, he started when he was 18 years old. And he was abused also as a child by his mother. And he was very smart, but an outcast, so to speak. And so he was finding some way to, I guess, have a thrill. And he started killing when he was 18. He killed his next door, his friend's mother. It was a next door neighbor type of thing. And he was highly organized, became the prime suspect in that murder and another murder, but was able through all of his, he passed a lie detector at age 18. He had his own lawyer without any parental involvement. So he was a very accomplished 18-year-old high school senior. And so he was organized, and then over his entire career became quite disorganized, because he graduated the risk because the thrill had to be bigger, and eventually the risk caused mistakes. And something like, selling things in a garage sale, he would give his booty to his father as a Christmas present, things like that. So, my experience of this had a lot to do with sort of looking at the organized versus the disorganized killer, and looking at and finding how in 2 cases, there was the third killer that I was pretty familiar with. In 2 cases, the person really became a total monster. Absolutely, there's no question. I think the woman who killed her children, it was a kind of a planned event that was attempting to solve a problem, a specific problem she had. Clearly, she crossed over some line. I mean, infanticide is not understood, but it's not uncommon. And usually it's the character. What I find amusing, in a sense, about modern-day marketing is that when you write a true crime novel or true crime book, your agent may well tell you to make sure that there's a sympathetic character there, that whether it's the detective who is going to solve this case, or it's somehow the killer also you can have a sympathy for that killer. It's this idea that we all somehow want to identify with this topic, and it drills right into the brain. The question that was initially asked, or brought up: could any of us, do this? Could any of us actually get to that point? Even refreshing my material to be here today, really brought a huge sense of gloom all over me. And I wasn't even sure how many people would be here because of the topic. But then I thought, well, I remember my book editor was the most popular person at all the cocktail parties and dinners she ever went to, because everybody just wanted to ask her about the latest case. So I think, I'm going to vote that there are both kinds.
Okay, I want to ask Cho about his view of China, and I want to bring in a subtype, and that has been described by Hannah Arendt as the banality of evil, that in certain circumstances, people do horrible things. The Stanley Milgram experiment of where under authority, orders from authority figures, the college students would torture people, or what we've seen happen in Guantanamo. In China, under the Red Guard, there was an era of terrible killing and destruction, and your novels are set in a China that is entering a new phase of life. What is your view of state-sanctioned killers and the tensions that people experience trying to maintain their integrity in such systems?
Well, first I may say, about the two schools you mentioned earlier. I kind of agree with John.
Excuse me, could you speak up?
Okay, yeah, I kind of agree with John. Maybe both, both schools. Even though I'm a little bit more inclined toward the first. Because in my novel, toward the end, the detective says to the criminal, what happened to you could have happened to me, could have happened to me. Of course, the background of my novel can be quite different from things here. It's not just like, somebody born evil. I try to, through this main character, to find in what way, in what kind of culture, in what kind of society a person can be shaped into evil, Actually, my interest in this was quite early, simply because there was not only any school of you have mentioned about the evil. In China, when I grew up, basically there was no psychology or no discussion of this kind of criminal mind. If somebody was a criminal, it was just because the political reason. Okay, he killed somebody because he was a class enemy, he was a counter-revolutionary, and the psychoanalysis basically was out of question. Because if you talk to someone about some evil thought in your mind, the doctor should report to the authority maybe tomorrow, right? And that could get people into trouble. How can you talk to people about your trouble? And also, I think at that time, there's some logic in official discourse. If you study Chairman Mao's work hard enough, you won't have any problem, okay? If you have problems, that means just you did not study Chairman Mao's work good enough. And another thing I thought about that, it's also in the book, it's, for many years, in the Chinese language, we did not even have the word for privacy. I started translating in the late 70s when I had the English word privacy. I could not find a Chinese equivalent. I have to use a phrase, a sentence, because privacy in Chinese at that time basically means something bad, something you cannot share with other people, something negative. So that's how I become, really interested in psychology. But my major, of course, was in literature. So I was more interested not just in Freud, but also in Carl Jung, the collective unconscious, the archetype, this kind of things. Because again, in my field in comparative literature, so there's always some difference, right? And I thought, well, these are Western concepts, whether they can be applied to China, like Oedipus complex. Do we have something similar in Chinese society? And if you're talking about archetype, can that be modified by the Chinese society, right? So that's something, I've been thinking about for quite a long time. That's when, I start writing this book. I thought, well, I should give it a try in the book, because it's way before I start writing this book. So in the novel, the criminal is someone really shaped by what happened to him during the Cultural Revolution. His mother was raped and killed, and he witnessed the thing, and that of course he adored his mother, and that's something similar to Oedipus complex, right? But of course there's something different, and in Asian China, we all know something called arranged marriage. Basically, according to that discourse, it's love, or any sexual love is something to be forbidden, because if you marry somebody, it's just for the family line to have baby. If you do that, because that in classical Chinese literature or philosophy, woman in love or woman in sexual love is often identified as demon. Not just like siren here, okay? If anybody do that, it's against the Confucius discourse. So that a lot of things goes into the book, and that's why. And the criminal, on the one hand, he still maintains a normal appearance. He's even tried to do something good for the people, but on the other hand, once he's pushed over the edge, he cannot control himself. So, back to your word, kind of sympathetic toward him. The cop is also sympathetic toward him.
Okay. I want to say something real quick. When I was on my book tour, and I would read, passages from my book about things that happened to me as I was growing up, and then reading some of the bank robbery stories, I was always surprised by people who came up to me, male, female, from 18 to 65, people who would come and confess to me, I always thought about robbing a bank. And it startled me. I mean, the amount of times that occurred was absolutely surprising. And I think and then they would say, I identify with your story, because you can be implicated in my story in a bunch of different ways that have nothing to do with committing bank robbery. There was abuse, there was sexual abuse, there was divorce, there was just a bunch of different things that people identify. But what I came to understand that as is that people understood my impulse to trespass. And they identified that, I've wanted to trespass. And then some of them would confess, I did stuff that I wasn't caught for, that I never got caught for. So I've always felt I'm not surprised by if my neighbor was somebody who they found 5 bodies under their house. I would not be the person on TV that said, oh my God, I can't believe that my neighbor did that. I would be like, that makes sense. That person wanted to trespass just like I did, and they found their own little niche. But that was very interesting on my book tour.
Okay. Let me turn to a slightly different topic raised by your story and what we saw here, and that is that criminals, hopefully more often than not, wind up in prison. And prison has been termed the crime of punishment by Karl Menninger, who said that our systems of punishment are dehumanizing, extravagantly expensive, and quite ineffective. Our present legal procedures encourage a system of punishment made to fit the crime rather than the criminal. Are prisons sadistic training grounds for crime? Or are they places that help keep communities safe by segregating criminals? Are they a deterrent from your neighbors who don't commit crimes because they don't want to go to prison? Or is it ever possible for somebody to be rehabilitated in prison? Dr. Sreenivasan, you've spent time in prison trying to understand and help people. What's your perspective?
It's true. I haven't done time in prison, but I have worked in prison. When I first started working in prison, I was at Terminal Island in the 80s, and I would hear the stories these guys would tell me, and I thought, oh my God, there but for the grace of God go I. And then you'd look at their files, and it was like, these people are like real different than me. And I'm not going to. I had a bank robbers group, Joe, and
Group?
Yeah, they were all
Okay.
bank robbers, and I ended up getting them because we had a mandate to do treatment with them. Nobody wanted them, and so I was lowest rung, so I had like 12 of these guys who were all bank robbers. And I started the group by saying, you guys are obviously not good at bank robbery, otherwise you wouldn't be sitting here. And that totally pissed them off at me, and that started our therapeutic journey. But so I don't know how much I rehabilitated them, but over the course of the 20 years that I've been doing that, I do evaluations where I'm probably the bad guy because I do sexually violent predator evals for the state of California, and so I'm one of two doctors who locks them up, and those guys don't like me. But I also work for the VA, and I do veterans outreach groups for the veterans, and wide variety. Some of the people are actually getting out of prison. Some, the California Men's Colony lifers aren't, and it may be my own rose-colored glasses, but I do see the potential for rehabilitation, at least in those veterans in prison. And our groups have been oriented towards adopting an identity of them being a veteran and going back to that honorably discharged veteran status. So we begin with the Pledge of Allegiance, we end with their pledge, we do different ceremonies. And some of the guys like at CMC who are lifers, they may never get out. They have committed murders, many. But I think that there is that potential for rehabilitation. However, there's another slice of people that I've seen doing sexually violent predator evaluations who are highly psychopathic, incredibly sadistic, and who are very, very dangerous people. And the best thing for society is to incapacitate them. And I don't think everybody can be rehabilitated.
Having been in there, prisoners, I find, are some of the pettiest people I've ever met. Unskilled at dealing with our insecurities, and that's where you find like a guy like the Iceman, which his ethos of I got disrespected, I needed to really overcompensate by doing some bad harm. I mean, there's stories in prison where somebody gets cut off in the chow line, so he goes to his cell, gets a knife, comes back and stabs the guy just because the guy was 20 people down and cut in front of him. He just takes it so personally, and obviously the punishment doesn't fit the crime. There's this drastic, overkill, and it's because people get so agitated and hear echoes of humiliations from their past that they can't control the rage that comes up. And so when you put people in this prison and you just humiliate them every day, it's difficult for them to overcome and develop skills to deal with this because they're just getting humiliation overload. They're just getting echoes of abuse from the past overload. And so in that way, prisons are really, really, really bad for folks because it is just one humiliation after the other. When I was locked in solitary confinement, I was given one roll of toilet paper a week. And if I got diarrhea or something, God forbid, and I went through my roll in 4 days, I was like literally shit out of luck. I just couldn't, I could not, they would not give it to me and use it as a way to like mock me, And so then this would rise, and I would be in my solitary confinement, and it would just like I would be eaten up with rage and get headaches and stomach aches and just fantasize about all the evil I could do when I got out because I had this congested rage and I could not attack anyone while I was in there. So, do prisons exacerbate the problem and not give people skills? Definitely, because besides the fact that we hear echoes of humiliation so easily, we get this congested rage. The majority of the men in prison are not well educated. There's tons of mental illness in prison. So these are these are ways that it makes it even more difficult for guys to figure out ways to change their lives. Fortunately for me, because when I went into prison, I changed my life in solitary confinement. And so there's folks who say, wow, man, you changed your life drastically in solitary confinement. Maybe we should put everyone in solitary confinement. And then I tell people that the paradox is it was the worst experience of my life. I went mad. I started hallucinating, started hearing voices. And it humiliated me, and it humbled me. And it finally broke me. But on the other hand, it was the best experience that ever happened, because it allowed me to get past my arrogance and to be humbled in a way that made me say, I give up. I'm not the ubermensch I thought I was, kind of thing. So the difference, though, and the reason I don't recommend that you put everyone in is I was fortunate. I went in there with a lot of resources. I had education. I had access to language. I was smart enough so that when I read a George Lakoff book that slipped into my cell called Metaphors We Live By, that like totally changed it helped me develop a whole different relationship to metaphor or to language. And so I went in there with resources. I was able to, to develop some self-awareness. And like I said, most people are uneducated or mental illness or just can't get past themselves. They're not going to do well in solitary confinement. They're not going to do well when they get out of prison. And I see that all the time with the population I deal with who get out of prison, and we're trying to help them in the reentry. The relapse is so intense because, we'll tell them, you can't leave for a pass this weekend because you violated one of the house rules. And then they just go into some rage and attack someone, do something, and go back to prison because we didn't allow them to go out for 2 hours, and they're willing to sabotage their own life because of it. It's really difficult for people to change because the environment exacerbates the problem that got them there in the first place.
Okay. I'm going to invite questions from our audience or discussion. Please, if you'd like to, step up to the microphone and contribute.
A famous nutritionist once said that a certain percentage of rage comes from low blood sugar, hypoglycemia. And when he ran the prison diet, he reduced the internal crime by a noticeable amount. Hear anything about that?
No, Shoba.
Thanks, Spence.
No, I never heard that. But that makes sense.
I have
Nutrition.
heard about changing the color of the prison walls to more soothing colors. I'm not sure if that works either. Yes.
Okay. I'm thinking about people who kill in situations like war. Thinking Rusty Cowley back in the My Lai massacre, when it's not just killing your enemy. It's a outrageous explosion. People remember Rusty Cowley and My Lai massacre. He responsible for killing 200 women and babies, and just shooting them down, ordering his people to do that. So and I don't think he had any problems before that. So it sort of tells me that he was schooled in evil by the military, and I've been in the military, and I sort of know how they do that. So I'd like to hear any reactions to when obvious okay people, whether they're the American Dream Boy or just regular people, they go berserk, and then they kill. And this is happening all the time. You hear these postmen that go wild and go back to work. That's pretty evil, and they usually end up killing a lot of people they had no relationship with. And then, unfortunately, they often get killed themselves, so we don't get to hear what their stories. But I really like to hear everybody's opinion on that. Thank you.
Sure. Let me just start off by saying that there are articles in the professional literature about people who perpetrate atrocities, and Lieutenant Cowley is an example during Vietnam, but there are many, many others. And in fact, in many places in the world, atrocities are committed, sadly, on a routine basis, including atrocities committed by children now who are forced into the military in sub-Saharan Africa. I think a lot depends on the specific circumstances, but it is a problem that threatens humanity.
Well, there was a moment in in Missoula, Montana, when this killer that was the subject of the book, who did not serve in the military, this was in 1984, he had become good friends with a co-worker who had served in Vietnam and who was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And at one point in some evening, the friend decided to really come clean and confess all this stuff that was like burdening him, the atrocities that he had committed in Vietnam, just as you described, killing babies. And what was interesting to observe, the friend who told all this then sort of gauged the reaction of the protagonist in the book, the killer, and it was completely impossible to take. He laughed about it. He said, "Tell me more." He was getting off, so to speak, on the sort of horrible violence of it, but not absorbing any of the pathos or the meaning behind it, or even the meaning of his friend's need to have this cathartic confession. So that there also are cases, as I'm sure you know, where defendants who are accused of violent crimes use post-traumatic stress disorder as a defense, as a way of saying this happened to me in Vietnam, and this is now why I have killed these 2 children who are 8 years old. So I don't really, in terms of what I ended up doing, I ended up getting stories from people who had been in contact with killers. And it's interesting because as we heard the Iceman talk about 100, my first reaction was, I don't think he killed 100. He just, and this is another part of it, which is that they embellish. Yes.
I want to ask a sort of completely different question, which is there seems to be very little research whatsoever about sex offenders and outcomes of treatment and how they get, why one person, most people who get sexually abused would never dream of inflicting that on someone else, and yet a certain proportion seem to go on and do that. And I know that part of this is because the government won't fund research on sex, and you're not even allowed to, possess certain things that you might be wanting to use in treatment and stuff like that. But I just wonder, what can be done about that? And I write a lot about the addictions field, and there's the research in there is really horrible, and a lot of there's just a lot of stuff that is done in practice that we know is counterproductive, like confrontational, humiliating, attacking, and yet continues to be replicated and not moved into practice. So I just wondered if also that is going on in the sex field, and would love to hear what you said. Thanks.
Well, there's actually a fair amount of research about the efficacy of sex offender treatment, and the kind of treatment that's used most predominantly in the country right now is something called relapse prevention, cognitive behavioral model, and it does seem to be pretty effective in treating sex offenders. The downside of it is there's a certain group of sex offenders who are really dedicated recidivists, and oftentimes those people are the ones that you can't really touch real well with treatment until they get really old and kind of burn out on acting out. Especially child molesters, they have a pretty long course of being interested in that kind of behavior. With rapists, they tend to burn out earlier, but
Are these people who commit other kinds of crimes, or are these sort of pure breed sex offenders?
The rapists tend to be largely generalists. They do, robbery here, burglary there, rape here, that kind of thing. Whereas the child molesters tend to be, they tend to be largely people that, have good social skills, are, pro-social individuals in other aspects of their life, except for the sexual interest in children. And
Yes.
I have a question. After the discussion, which was really very interesting, what came to my mind is identity formation. Like, for example, the Iceman or the the Iceman, who would be clearly a monster. His identity, as I understand it from the short film, was that he identified with what he saw his family. He had like a very nice family, which is one part of him, that being part of his identity, but the other part was the earning money to sustain that, that family by killing people. So with the two views that were discussed in the beginning, the bad men who do bad things and good men who would dream of these things versus the psychopath, I think for me, you have to think about the two types that were discussed. What type of identity did these people have? Or did they have identity at all? Like this fellow said that he went to jail and he got a modification of his identity by being in solitary confinement. So I'd like to hear your view about identity formation prior to becoming what you become. Like in Zelig, for example, Woody Allen's film, Zelig had no identity, and as his therapy with Mia Farrow in the movie, a comical movie, he went from just becoming what everybody else did, taking on the persona of, what Woody Allen said in his Zelig film, to being just the opposite. After therapy, he became enraged at people as opposed to being acquiescing. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about identity formation. Thank you.
Well, let me just reflect and then.
Okay.
There is this phenomenon of doubling where somebody has what appears on one hand to be a normal pro-social life, but on the other hand seems to have a, terribly antisocial streak about him. And, this is common in novels, especially in crime novels, from, Murder of Roger Ackroyd, where Agatha Christie shows the, benevolent physician as the murderer. P.D. James loves to do these kinds of things. Mystery fiction delights with the person who is the cold-blooded killer, but yet in many other ways seems to be the normal citizen.
Hannibal Lecter.
Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah, in postmodernist theories, identity is always being constructed and deconstructed all the time by the languages or by the discourse or the value system. So in one sense, you can say, like, at a given time, you may have different languages, right? Different discourses at the same time. So I believe a person might be influenced by more than one particular set of the value system. So maybe, at one point of time, he's more influenced by this particular value system. He appears novel, but at others. So this kind of discourse is always in conflict. So in that sense, you can say, in Chinese we say, like he's possessed by the devil. It's really possessed by the devil's discourse, but it's not always possessed by the devil's discourse, right? So in that sense, you can say that identity is always shifting.
My name is Larry Cutler. Cali was mentioned, Vietnam, and just Cali. And I was wondering, since a couple of American soldiers were mentioned in Iraq, and of course there's a lot of people being killed, civilians being killed in Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Congo, the Balkans. Some people think that, and you mentioned authoritarianism, the authorities would tell the underlings, do this, do that, including killing. Do you think that the leaders, some of us believe that a lot of these leaders order these things and approve of these things? Do you think that they are doing criminal behavior when they order these things? A lot of us do believe that they really are ordering these things, but don't take the blame for it, like Rumsfeld, for example, in Iraq, or whomever in Vietnam, when they dropped whatever they dropped. Is that criminal And are they criminals? Even, I don't want to go too far with this, but even Truman dropping those A-bombs when he didn't have to. But are they criminals too?
For me,
Yeah.
what Mao did during the Cultural Revolution, he was a criminal.
Okay.
But in his mind, maybe in his own discourse, what he did makes sense. Makes sense only to himself.
And
But to
Bush?
me, that's a crime.
And Bush?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd like to know if there's any biochemical or brain imagery research with psychopaths that would show any differences between them and the so-called normal population.
There is actually fMRI studies by Keel and Hare, Keel and Hare, and other people have published on that. What they've shown is that there seems to be limbic system under reactivity. So emotionally, when they're hurting somebody, they're not picking up on those emotional cues. They're just more frontally activated and purposeful in their behavior, but they don't pick up the emotional cue of pain when they're torturing somebody. So that's the kind of prevailing theory, and it sort of goes with the psychopathy checklist scale, the two factors, factor 1, which is the glibness factor, factor 2, which is more of a lifestyle of juvenile delinquency, gang membership, that kind of thing. And this fMRI stuff seems to tag into the first factor, where people have that kind of Teflon relationships with other people. So it's preliminary, but that those are some of the...
Is there anything theoretical as to whether they're born that way or made that way?
I don't... Spence, would that be congenital, you think? Limbic underreactivity?
Yes.
I want to say something about when I was beat a lot as a kid and kicked in the head and punched in the face and stuff, and so I endured a lot of concussions.
Yeah.
This fuzzy state of being, and I know that when I was committing my crimes, it was almost I felt that same sort of like it's now I identify as moral laziness, but it was a sort of hazard. A moment where I was, involved in hazard, and that felt an awful lot like the fuzzy feeling I had as a concussion. That state of being, which I always thought was peculiar, but there was a seduction to that sort of. It almost allowed me to move through the criminal act because what you might identify as Teflon, there was some looseness to it. It made my reality and my reaction to it kind of porous. It wasn't a sort of concrete thing, I always thought that was peculiar because I wondered how much of the beatings as a child familiarized me with that feeling, and I wanted to replicate it in some way or get that. I was always kind of. I'm not a scientist or brain scientist about this stuff, but that's just a piece of intelligence I gathered from the other side of taboo.
At the most basic level, it is certainly well known that most psychopaths are men, which is a genetic characteristic, and most are young. And there's a variety of what we call gene-environment interactions that somehow produce that mental state that facilitates these kinds of crimes in vulnerable individuals. And there's no question that child abuse is one of those environmental experiences that is so terribly pathologic. And we know, for instance, that young girls who are physically abused frequently go on to suffer from depression. Males tend to go on often to be aggressive, to turn that outward. But much, much more work needs to be done. And of course, as clinicians, Shoba and I and our colleagues are faced with people after those experiences have occurred, trying to figure out ways to help them overcome it.
One of the things I was struck by throughout the discussion, kind of coming back to the theme of imagination, being that we're at the Center for the Multidisciplinary Study of Imagination, is one of the comments about I think the second clip that you showed was that it seemed like he was playing a role, that he had created a character, and especially with the serial killers, it's almost like an elaborate piece of performance art. They're creating something out of their life that is almost separate from them. It's a performance. And then, you're writing about kind of getting inside the criminal mind as a writer, and then with Joe being in solitary confinement, in a way using your imagination to, in a sense, cure yourself or to reform yourself. And I was just wondering if, in a way, it's a malformation of the imagination that takes place when people, in a way, misuse their imaginative power to do diabolical things rather than to do constructive things.
Well, there is there's a body of thought that is fairly core. The clinicians may agree or disagree, but that a lot of serial killers act out of a need to gain control. They are out of control. They perceive their life to be out of control, so they, in some way or another, want to reassert control. In the one case that I followed, it was a woman who had her life was spun out of control, and it had been that way for a long time. So now she was actually back living with her mother. So she was really trying to recreate, in a sense, relive. She was forced to being reliving a childhood scenario where she would be in complete control and she would take care of this, and it was a sort of disassociation from reality, but it was all about getting control. And the other character that I wrote about also needed to be in control, and that moment of being in control was not only the essence of the whole thing, it was the thrill of his experience. To be in control, finally, I'm in control. It's the world that he had created through his imagination that gave him all this control bore no resemblance to the rest of the world that we all live in. And that's sort of an interesting, I don't want to take the leap to the gentleman who spoke about Iraq and wars and Bush, but in some way, a lot of this is all about sociology. It's all about, you can have the clinical evidence that would point to a brain condition or even a lymphatic, some kind of condition, biochemical, that causes what you were describing. But if it isn't presented carefully and adroitly in court, or if it's screwed up in front of a jury, then it doesn't really go anywhere, and we just keep on living in this cycle.
Let me comment on the issue of imagination, and what I associate to are the suicide bombers, the terrorists who are motivated by their fantasy of what their terrorist act means, where they will be going, the martyrdom, the imagination of martyrdom, and the religious fervor and fanaticism that these people can be caught up with, to the extent that they're willing to kill themselves and everybody around them, shows the power of that imagination, that fantasy, which they've come to believe.
I think, real quick, I want to say something about control. I think the identity of the criminal is not unlike the way people develop identity out here. And I'm of the belief that we all, in cinematic days, we all been raised with TV and film, that we walk around the world and we are creating our own narrative, and oftentimes, we're even giving ourselves a soundtrack by the music we play when we walk down the street, thinking, look at how I'm being perceived, the way I dress, look at how I am at a party. And I just think that there's ways in which we identify ourselves. And the criminal, I feel like, is trying to control their narrative, trying to control the criminal narrative, which is why we're such great storytellers in prison, because we want other people to identify us as these sort of discrete stories of the crimes we committed. One of the things I always found extremely interesting is if you talk to men in prison, they basically all have the same 8 movies in their library at home. Casino, Godfather, Goodfellas. It's like as if they're looking for ways to learn how to perform criminality, because so much of our crime is performance and is cinema. And when I would leave a bank, I experimented several times with the soundtrack I wanted to have as I left the bank. First, I started off with "Smooth Criminal" by Michael Jackson, but then I realized, that's not me. So I went deeper, and I got "Comfortably Numb" by Pink Floyd. And after every bank robbery, I'd put it in. I would drive up the coast to LA. But there was a way in which I was trying to organize my life in a cinematic way. So I think that the shaping of the identity is we're trying to control our narrative by the stories we tell other people to be perceived by, but also in our own heads. I want to act tough, like in Heat or in Casino or something like that.
Recently, I was listening to a podcast by someone named Barbara Oakley, who's written a book out called Evil Genes, that's out now. And she claimed that the experiments done by Zimbardo and Millman are now in dispute, that people don't really accept those anymore. And since it was brought up here, I was wondering, that was a surprise to me. I was wondering, is that really the case?
But who were
These experiments that were done, where Milgram and Zimbardo, where people were brought in as an experiment, told to give shocks to people, and supposedly they would do more and more with actually killing the person, and that this was, these were done 40, 50 years ago, that people, under the right conditions, anyone would do evil. And she claimed that those experiments, for one thing, they've never been duplicated. And, roughly 1/3 of all experiments turn out to be false, initially. And the ones that tend to get published, even peer-reviewed, are ones that are the most sensational, that are going to attract the most attention. And she claimed that these experiments really don't matter anymore.
I know with Zimbardo's Prisoner's Dilemma, he had college students from Stanford, one set were prisoners, one set were guards, and they really kind of identified with this, and the experiment had to be stopped because one of the people started to go crazy. I actually know the person who went crazy, Doug Corpy, and Doug claims, he's a psychologist now, a forensic psychologist who does SVP evals. He said he just did that because he needed to go leave to take his GREs, and he just couldn't stay there anymore, and he just said, I'm going crazy, and and so that's Doug's story, and I think there was actually a film about Zimbardo's whole thing. So
yeah, but he advertised. He was doing a prison experiment, so people who answer the ad were people who'd be interested in, would attract a certain crowd of people. Yeah. But you still see in the popular press, these are taken as sort of gospel. Everyone quotes these to this very day as being the truth, and it looks, at least according to her, they're really not.
I think you're right. I think the opposite side of that is I think people have an incredible potential for good, and that's what I see. And I see that even among the veterans who are doing time, life in prison, and they've committed murders, but the things that they're the most proud of is their service in Vietnam. A lot of them are combat vets. They don't see their killing that got them into prison as related to their honorable discharge of their duty in a theater of combat. So, and I think they would have probably been upset to hear themselves characterized as killing monsters when they were out there doing what their country wanted them to do. But their criminal killing came about because of drugs and stuff. But even they're very interested in helping other people, wanting to help the returning Iraq combat vets not go through the bumpiness that they did. So I believe that the opposite side's true. I think people are capable of incredible good.
On the other hand, when you look internationally at the Khmer Rouge, where a quarter of the population of the country died as a result of murder, of starvation, of disease, perpetrated by their own citizens. When you look at Darfur, you can't help but feel that under the right circumstances, where authority are in control and are sending out brutal, sadistic instructions, that many people behave in a manner that we would consider at the least immoral, if not evil.
Milgram was replicated recently for TV in something that was very unethical, but it did replicate.
I was actually impressed by how these clips were put together, the ones that you showed. I mean, it was sort of like these, with the creepy music. These people are clearly freaks, and they're presented as freaks on these TV shows. I mean, that's what we're meant to think. We're not meant, I think, to identify with them. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. I agree. We don't want to believe. People don't want to believe that they're the same human material as that. Right. That the same pressures on their moral poise would lead them to behave like that.
Because so we they could have been presented in a different way.
In which you felt implicated in their trespassing. I agree. Yeah. The music and all this, the drama of it, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, any last comments from our panelists or from the audience?
I had just one request, which is
yes.
We met earlier and you told a story about, this was after the first roundtable that you did, you told a story about a case here in New York where a husband was kind of caught red-handed stabbing his wife and wasn't convicted because it ended up being a dissociative episode or something like that. Can you talk a little bit about how in the legal system the criminal mind is perceived in such ways that,
Sure, and I think
even though they've clearly committed a crime.
Sure, I think John alluded to that. The law is dichotomous. You're either guilty or not guilty, and not guilty doesn't mean innocent. It just means that your guilt hasn't been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And in the case that I had mentioned in a prior roundtable, there was a defense that this man was not conscious of his act, and the jury believed the forensic psychiatrist and the man's testimony to that effect. Some of the other cases that we heard about that Dr. Sreenivasan talks about, there is a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. And that's a very different legal argument which says that the person did it, but at the time was aware but not realizing that what he did was wrong or was not fully appreciating what he was doing. The vast majority of those cases result in conviction. Even in people who we might be very sympathetic towards, such as the mother who's in a postpartum depression and kills her infants, those cases most often result in conviction. Whether those people have criminal minds or not, I think is a very different issue than the serial killers and the cold-blooded killers and the other criminals that we've been talking about today. I want to thank our hosts, and I want to thank the Imagination Center. I want to thank my fellow panelists, and especially the audience for an enjoyable afternoon on a dreadful topic.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philip Tades events is available at philiptades.org.